You scan the same groceries and boom, the price total jumps to double what you're used to. Should you stock up now before things get even more expensive? Tariffs add to the cost before goods even reach the aisle, and that bump rolls through the supply chain from importers to distributors to stores straight to you. Some staples spike fast, others sit like time bombs until contracts reset. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're revealing how these tariffs are affecting Americans and who is really paying the price. To President Trump, America's trade deficit wasn't just a problem, it was a national emergency. In response, his administration's answer was tariffs, slapped on almost the entire world. It began with a 10% baseline tariff on all imported goods, followed by customized tariffs against individual nations. Global markets crashed, suffering their worst drop since the 2020 COVID pandemic. The domestic downturn only deepened as trade wars ignited with Canada and Mexico, while tensions with China flared even higher. The U.S. economy slid into a sharp decline in the first months of the administration. Liberation Day alone wiped out billions in investments, though a temporary pause on the tariffs and fresh negotiations helped spark a rally by midsummer. Tariffs placed on uninhabited islands, populated only by penguins, only made them even more confusing. So what effect are they actually having on you, the average consumer? One of the biggest pieces of the ongoing tariff war comes from Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. These two metals are everywhere. They're used in everything from consumer products to critical military hardware. The tariffs first appeared in 2018 after the Department of Commerce concluded that imports of steel and aluminum posed a threat to national security. Because of concerns over relying on nations that could one day turn hostile, the U.S. imposed an extra 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports, everywhere except Russia. But the blanket policy didn't last. Soon countries like Canada and Mexico were granted partial or full exemptions. Even certain steel products were carved out, especially those vital to the U.S. economy or nearly impossible to source elsewhere. After taking office for a second time, these tariffs were re-upped by 25% on both and brought in to include more products with fewer exemptions. The effect of both sets of tariffs was broadly felt across the U.S. On the positive side, the tariffs drove more investment in domestic production, just as intended to strengthen national security. Within the mining and refining industries, there's been some job growth and even increases to wages as focus returns to producing at home. The negative effects were felt outside of the metals industry. As domestic steel and aluminum production rose, downstream industry prices increased due to having to pay higher prices. Hot-rolled steel, a standard benchmark for tracking steel prices, much like oil is tracked by the barrel, skyrocketed between 2017 and 2021. Prices jumped by around 160% from around $700 per metric ton to over $1,800. This reflects both a global price increase due to inflation and the COVID pandemic, but prices in the U.S. rose higher than anywhere else. Aluminum increased in price by 45% during the same time period, with again the United States experiencing a higher price hike than anywhere else. The U.S. International Trade Council, or USITC, even developed a special formula to measure the impact of steel and aluminum tariffs. Without the effects of COVID-19 and other global events, they determined that the impact on downstream industries was almost exclusively negative, with U.S. industries losing on average $3.4 billion in value between 2018 and 2021. The worst affected were industrial machinery manufacturing, cutlery and hand tool manufacturing, motor vehicle steering suspension components and brake systems, general-purpose machinery, agriculture, mining, and construction manufacturing, and other fabricated metal products. These industries saw production values drop by almost 3%, losing $500 million by 2021. For the individual consumer, the prices on everything from U.S.-made cars, tools, and appliances rose. Construction was partially affected, with costs of HVAC systems increasing and supply chain disruptions. Increased delivery times due to supply chain bottlenecks also added additional costs to U.S. industry. Recent increases to tariffs means that the U.S. can expect a similar development in the next few years. Where you'll feel it the most is likely going to be in bottled or canned goods, such as canned food and soft drinks, which are all expected to increase in price. Car parts and appliances are set to rise in price as U.S. steel and aluminum producers struggle with higher import costs. The new 2025 tariffs target specific auto parts, piling on top of the broader metal tariffs already driving up manufacturing expenses. Expect vehicle prices in the U.S. to climb moderately over the next year. If you're thinking of purchasing a home in the future, the effects of tariffs on metals is also going to increase home buying costs. Everything from siding to fixtures and beams is going to be affected by increased tariffs, raising the price of production for contractors. It's not just home buyers who can expect to be in the firing line, though. Small contractors can expect to bear the worst brunt of it. While larger developers can absorb some of the cost of tariffs, small independent contractors typically don't have the liquid assets to ride out economic waves. They can expect much tighter margins, which will force them to increase the cost of their bids, in many cases making them uncompetitive against big builders. What could change the situation the most is the future of trade negotiations with Canada and Mexico, the main suppliers of U.S. aluminum and steel. Any volatility in those relations could see a massive surge in prices. Section 301 tariffs, introduced in 2018, were aimed squarely at Chinese imports, but according to the U.S. International Trade Commission, the effect was almost 1-to-1. Import prices jumped nearly dollar for dollar, with U.S. importers shouldering nearly all of the cost. That cost is passed on to consumers, with the U.S. ITC discovering that prices of household furniture and kitchen cabinets rose by 7.1%. Domestic goods rose by 3-4% as prices for Chinese components climbed. In some cases, like semiconductors and electronic parts, costs spiked as much as 25%. And it wasn't just Chinese-made electronics that got more expensive. The reduced supply pushed up prices across the entire electronics market. Again, this reflects an expected trend to follow President Trump's new tariffs. Currently, the tariff on China fluctuates wildly, and it's difficult to predict where it'll go next. As of August 2025, tariffs on Chinese exports sit at 57.6%, which is why if you've been shopping on Amazon, you're probably seeing a big price hike on some of your favorite products. Hoping to avoid consumer backlash, Amazon planned to show shoppers the exact price increases caused by new tariffs. Things are only going to get worse for consumers from here on out. As it's been pointed out many times by financial experts, the tariffs are not in fact reciprocal. Instead, they are unilateral, and they hit nations without consideration of any existing trade imbalance or why that imbalance exists. In some cases, the claimed U.S. trade deficit doesn't even make sense. For example, take a nation like Zimbabwe, which was hit with an 18% tariff due to the U.S. having a trade deficit of $24.3 million. Yet, just seeing the words trade deficit doesn't actually tell you what's going on, because the fact is that trade deficits are extremely common in global trade, especially between rich and poor nations. Zimbabwe, like many poor nations, exports raw materials and low-tech manufactured goods to the United States. The U.S. benefits, but Zimbabwe sees little capital in return. Because wages are so low, most Zimbabweans can't afford American goods. The result is a one-sided trade deficit. The U.S. imports from Zimbabwe but exports very little back. The tariffs ignore a basic truth economists have known since global trade began. By slapping high tariffs on nations too poor to buy American goods, the U.S. only ensures they stay too poor to ever afford them, locking in the very trade deficit it claims to fight. This isn't always the case, but it is a lot of the time. Some industrialized nations like China can impose unfair tariffs on U.S. goods in order to make them non-competitive. This is known as protectionism, and it is ironically exactly what the U.S. is doing now. Sometimes, though, like with steel and aluminum, this might be a necessary step for national security. It's worth noting that the very problem these steel and aluminum tariffs are meant to fix largely came from U.S. companies themselves, choosing to move production overseas where costs were cheaper. But in many cases, the tariffs don't appear to make much economic sense. The U.S. is far from getting a better deal with costs expected to rise across the board for Americans, who are already seeing less purchasing power for their dollar than ever before. One of the biggest hits to U.S. consumers was the suspension of duty-free de minimis. Typically, anything imported into the U.S. with a value under $800 was exempt from tariffs. If you played tabletop RPGs and buy miniatures from the UK, China, or anywhere overseas, you've probably already felt it. Tariffs now hit even small purchases under $800. Even small items that you might buy online are being processed as regular imports for the sake of tariffs. This leads to sticker shock for many Americans who were caught unaware. Going back to car buyers, imported vehicles and a lot of vehicle parts will face a 25% duty no matter where they're imported from. However, an amendment enacted in late April is meant to limit the stacking of multiple tariffs on vehicles and other finished goods. So in other words, if you go shopping for a new car and you pick foreign, you won't have to worry about paying the tariff on the metal used to build the car, as well as the tariff on the vehicle itself. Instead, only the duty on the vehicle will be charged. However, as in most industries, the 25% tariff is being largely passed on to you, the consumer, rather than borne by the importer alone. A second important exemption to prevent the auto market from crashing is the use of assembly credits to reduce the duty owed to the government. If Honda assembles a vehicle here in the United States, it becomes eligible for special U.S. assembly credits that go toward lowering the overall duty. As a consumer, you'll see the biggest price hikes on foreign-made vehicles. Cars from international brands built partly or entirely in the U.S. will rise too, but the increase will be smaller. Domestic auto manufacturers should see a direct benefit as consumers turn to alternatives, though U.S. brands unfortunately struggle with an inferior reputation versus established global brands. This could push buyers to spend more upfront on a car that they believe will save them money on maintenance down the road. And that will be important as they consider the increase in cost to all auto parts due to metal tariffs. The new 50% tariff on steel and aluminum is expected to increase costs nearly everywhere. American manufacturers and construction firms will have to reevaluate their bottom lines and are already passing the costs on to consumers as a result. Particularly worrying, though, is the disruption caused by price increases and uncertainty to major developers, who often plan projects out a decade or more in advance. By delaying or even canceling construction projects, the tariff hikes don't just hurt today's economy, they also threaten tomorrow's by wiping out future real estate developments and the growth that would have once come with them. If you're a fan of dressing well, or even if you do your shopping at Walmart, expect to be paying more for your clothing. You don't have to just like fancy brand names, because a significant part of the U.S. garments industry comes from overseas nations impacted by tariffs. This is of most pressing concern to American parents. America's low-income families are, as usual, the most vulnerable, as sneakers nearly double in price and clothing in general increases by a whopping 37% across the board. Clothing and apparel is one of the most affected industries by Liberation Day tariffs. But there is hope that as brands switch to alternate sourcing, prices could stabilize at around an 18 to 19% increase over the long run. With tariff exemptions on parcels under $800 now suspended, the fast fashion industry is expected to take a big hit. But some experts argue that it could be a net positive since fast fashion's environmental impact is so severe. E-commerce overall is expected to take a major hit, losing hundreds of millions of dollars as shoppers shy away from the cheap items they once bought tariff-free. Per the Congressional Budget Office, it's believed that the new tariffs will increase inflation by 0.4% over the next year, though GDP growth is only expected to slow slightly. However, Yale's Budget Lab projects a sharper 0.5% drag on growth, an outlook echoed by Jerome Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve. The Yale study also predicts that individual households will see an increase of $2,400 in spending during 2025. But that's only if the Federal Reserve doesn't react by adjusting interest rates. The problem is that the Trump administration has openly threatened to fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell after Powell warned about the dangers of the tariff regime. That loss of independence would rattle confidence in the Federal Reserve, leaving businesses unsure of the true state of the economy. In that kind of uncertainty, one bad bet could sink entire companies. For consumers, the fallout would be wild price swings and almost inevitably major inflation in the future. Right now, U.S. consumers are best off saving their money and holding off on big purchases, at least until new trade deals are reached or the market stabilizes. Trump's tariffs are already hitting Americans' wallets, but what happens if things spiral even further? Find out in What If the U.S. Economy Crashes, or click on this video instead.